My father's warnings were always cryptic and sharp. Never go into the barn after dark, Alex. If you value your life, you'll listen. He refused to explain further, and my curiosity festered over the years. At 22, I no longer feared his old superstitions. I had to see what secrets he was hiding in that decrepit structure. It was a full moon when I finally made my move. The air was unusually still, as if the world was holding its breath. The barn door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally. Inside, the stench hit me first, a pungent mix of iron, rot, and something worse, something sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. The faint light of my phone illuminated the walls. My breath hitched as the gruesome truth revealed itself. Strips of flesh, human, animal, unidentifiable, were stretched taut across the wooden planks, nailed into place like grotesque works of art. Faces were among them, skinned clean and pinned like hunting trophies. The eyes were missing, leaving hollow voids that seemed to watch me anyway. Buckets lined the floor, filled with coagulated blood, severed limbs, and entrails that shimmered in the dim light. Flies buzzed furiously, their wings creating a droning hum. I stumbled back, gagging, but my retreat was short-lived. The barn door slammed behind me, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. I spun around, but no one was there. Curiosity killed the cat. A guttural voice growled. I froze. From the shadows stepped a figure, a hulking man wearing a patchwork apron sewn from what I now realized was skin. His face was obscured by a mask made of stitched flesh, the seams oozing as if they were fresh. In his hand he held a butcher's knife, its edge glinting with blood that dripped in steady droplets onto the floor. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like rocks grinding together. I bolted, running toward the door, but the barn seemed to twist and stretch. My legs felt like lead, my movements sluggish. A heavy hand grabbed the back of my neck, yanking me off my feet. The next moments were a blur of pain and horror. He dragged me to a table slick with blood, strapping me down with belts that bit into my skin. The knife hovered above me, its blade gleaming like a predator's tooth. He didn't kill me right away. Instead, he toyed with me, carving shallow cuts into my flesh, peeling back the skin as if unwrapping a gift. I screamed until my throat was raw, but the barn seemed to absorb the sound, muffling it into nothingness. "Don't fight it," he murmured, his hands steady and methodical. "You'll make a fine addition." The pain was unbearable, a white-hot agony that blurred the edges of my vision. I blacked out, but not before seeing him hold up a strip of my own skin, inspecting it with a craftsman's pride. When I woke, I was lying in the dirt outside the barn. My clothes were soaked in blood, and my body ached with a deep, pulsing pain. I stumbled home, leaving a trail of red behind me. No one believed me. My father, pale as a ghost, said I must have been attacked by a wild animal. The doctors stitched me up and sent me on my way, their faces clouded with doubt. But I know the truth. Late at night, I hear whispers coming from the barn, calling my name, promising they'll finish what they started. And sometimes, in the mirror, I catch glimpses of my reflection, skin pale and stitched, like a patchwork doll. I think a part of me never left that barn. The old barn on the edge of town had always been an eyesore. Its warped wooden panels seemed to sag under the weight of time, the roof caved in just enough to give it a sinister, jagged silhouette against the horizon. As a kid, my friends and I dared each other to go inside, but no one ever mustered the courage. Even the adults avoided the place, muttering vague warnings about what happened there years ago. I always thought it was just small-town folklore, until that night. It began innocently enough. Our dog, Max, bolted from the yard, chasing something into the darkness. His bark grew distant, then stopped altogether. I called his name, my voice echoing against the still night, but there was no response. Panic bubbled in my chest as I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and followed the faint trail of his paw prints. They led straight to the barn. The rotten doors hung slightly ajar, swaying with the breeze like a set of broken jaws. Max! I shouted, the sound barely louder than the creak of the hinges. A faint whimper came from within. I hesitated, the smell of mildew and something sickly sweet wafting out, but the thought of leaving Max behind pushed me forward. The beam of my flashlight danced across the barn's interior, illuminating piles of discarded tools, rusty chains, and heaps of straw. The smell was worse inside, cloying, like decaying meat left too long in the sun. Max's whimper came again, more insistent this time, from the far corner. I hurried toward it, stepping over scattered debris, but stopped dead in my tracks when the light fell on them. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Rows of figures hung from the rafters like grotesque marionettes. Limbs were bound with barbed wire, their joints unnaturally bent as though someone had twisted them into submission. Their faces, God, their faces, were the stuff of nightmares. Some were carved into permanent masks of agony, mouths stretched wide as though frozen mid-scream. Others bore crudely sewn smiles, their lips puckered and stitched like some demented child's craft project. And then one of them moved. The figure twitched violently, its head jerking to one side as though straining against invisible strings. A garbled moan escaped its mouth, a sound no human should be capable of making. The others followed suit, their movements spasmodic and uncoordinated. It was like watching a macabre puppet show come to life. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. That's when I saw Max. He was crouched beneath one of the grotesque figures, his tail tucked between his legs, trembling. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A shadow moved behind me, and the floorboard creaked. Well, a raspy voice drawled. Looks like I've got me another one. I spun around, heart hammering. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the pale moonlight. His skin was a patchwork of scars, as though he'd been stitched together like the horrors hanging above me. In his hands was a pitchfork, the prongs glinting ominously. You've got no business here, he muttered, his voice gravelly and wet, like he was choking on phlegm. But you'll fit perfectly in my collection. The light caught his face as he stepped closer. His eyes were cold, devoid of any humanity, and his lips twisted into a grotesque sneer. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. He raised the pitchfork. That broke the spell. I turned and bolted, grabbing Max by the collar and dragging him behind me. The man roared, and the sound of his boots thudding against the floor sent my adrenaline into overdrive. I could hear the clatter of the puppets behind me, their limbs smacking against each other, as though animated by some unseen force. The barn seemed to stretch endlessly as I sprinted for the door. My flashlight beam bobbed wildly, catching glimpses of the man's work. One figure hung upside down, its eyes gouged out and replaced with black buttons. Another had its ribs splayed open, the bones painted red to resemble a grotesque flower in bloom. Strings of intestines dangled like festive garlands, their ends knotted into crude bows. The walls were smeared with handprints, bloody and frantic, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. I reached the door and threw myself against it, expecting resistance, but it flew open with ease. Max yelped as I nearly tripped over him, but we kept running, the sound of the farmer's footsteps pounding behind us. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him standing in the doorway, his pitchfork raised. For a moment I thought he would give chase, but he just stood there, watching. "You'll be back," he called, his voice carrying on the wind. "They always come back." The words chilled me to the bone. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my house. Max collapsed on the porch, panting heavily, and I slammed the door shut, locking it for good measure. But even as I sat there, catching my breath, the images from the barn refused to leave my mind. The faces. The twisted bodies. The farmer's cold, scarred visage. I should have reported it. Called the police, or at least told someone. But every time I tried, the words got caught in my throat. Who would believe me? It sounded insane, like the plot of some low-budget horror movie. Days turned into weeks, and I convinced myself it was just a nightmare. A vivid, terrible nightmare. Then Max disappeared again. This time, I didn't follow. We thought the barn was abandoned until we heard the machines. At first, it sounded like nothing more than the humming of an old generator, the kind you'd find in a forgotten corner of some farm, long since left to rot. But there was something off about it. The noise was too rhythmic, too methodical. It tugged at something deep in my gut, a primal instinct that told me to turn back, that we should never have come this far. But it was too late. My brother had already pulled open the barn door. The stench hit us first. It wasn't the usual smell of stale hay or the sharp tang of manure. No, this was something more visceral, more nauseating, a thick, metallic scent that made me gag. I stepped inside, barely able to see anything through the haze of dust and shadow. My brother called out to me, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the machinery. "Hey, it's just an old barn. Let's see if we can find anything worth taking." I hesitated. Something was wrong. My brother had always been the adventurous one, the one who dragged me into trouble, but this time I felt a dread creeping into my bones that I couldn't shake. Still, I stepped in, the creaking floorboards beneath my feet protesting every step. The darkness of the barn seemed to swallow us whole. The only light came from the faint flicker of a single, dying bulb hanging from the rafters. It cast long, trembling shadows that made the barn feel like it was alive, like it was watching us. I could hear the sound of my breath, shallow and quick, but the machinery, that grinding, rhythmic sound was getting louder. I had no idea what we were walking into. We stumbled through the barn, the floor beneath us slick with something wet and sticky, like the remnants of a long-forgotten rain. As we moved further in, I began to make out shapes in the gloom, old crates, rusted tools, and something else. Something darker. My heart raced, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. And then we saw it. At the far end of the barn, looming in the shadows, was an industrial shredder. The kind you'd find in a meatpacking plant, its massive metal teeth glinting in the dim light. The machine was running, though it seemed older, its surface marred with rust and the wear of years, maybe decades of use. The hum of the motor filled the air, a low, vibrating sound that shook the barn walls. But it wasn't just the machine that drew my attention. There was someone standing next to it. A man, dressed in a blood-stained apron, his hands caked in gore. He was feeding something into the machine, what, I couldn't see at first. But as I stepped closer, my stomach turned, bow rising in my throat. The man was feeding bodies into the shredder. Human bodies. Blood was splattered all over the walls, staining the metal and the floor, dripping from the machine in thick, slow rivulets. It wasn't just a couple of bodies either. There were piles of them, pieces of limbs, torsos hacked apart, and tossed into the grinder like meat. The noise of the shredder was drowned out by the sickening squelch as it tore through flesh and bone, the terrible gurgle of human life being swallowed by the machine. I froze, unable to move, my brain struggling to comprehend the horror unfolding before me. The man didn't seem to care that we were there, his eyes fixed on the grinder as he fed another body into it. His movements were mechanical, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. And then, the machine jammed. The sharp, grinding noise suddenly stopped, and a thick silence settled over the barn. The man cursed under his breath, slamming his fist into the side of the machine, but it didn't budge. His apron was soaked, his hands trembling with rage as he cursed again, louder this time. "Piece of shit," he muttered, then turned to us. His eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite place, something far more sinister than any madness I'd ever seen. "Looks like we've got new harvesters." Before I could react, he took a step toward us. His smile was wide, too wide, like he enjoyed seeing the fear in our eyes. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. My brother, however, had no such hesitation. "Run!" I screamed at him, but it was too late. The man lunged at him, his hands reaching out, claws outstretched. My brother barely had time to react before the man grabbed him by the arm and yanked him toward the shredder. My brother screamed, his voice high-pitched with terror, but it was drowned out by the sound of the machine whirring back to life. The man shoved my brother's face into the path of the grinder, and I heard the sickening crack of bone, the awful squelch of flesh being torn apart as the machine chewed through him. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat seeming to echo in the silence that followed. I felt the heat of my brother's blood splattering across my face as the shredder did its work. His screams were gone, replaced by the sickening gurgling of the machine. I could barely see him anymore, just a twisted mess of mangled flesh and blood, his body twisted into shapes that no human form should ever take. The man was laughing now, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "There's always room for more," he said, wiping his blood-soaked hands on his apron. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment I thought he was going to come after me next. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't die here, not like this. I turned and bolted, my legs finally responding to my frantic mind. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out of that barn. Behind me, I could hear the man's footsteps following, his laugh echoing in the darkness, bouncing off the walls like the sound of a predator closing in on its prey. I ran through the barn, crashing into crates and stumbling over the slick, blood-smeared floor. The barn door was just ahead, and I pushed with all my strength, the rusted metal screeching as it opened. I had no idea where I was running, but I didn't care. I just needed to escape. As I reached the edge of the barn, I glanced back. The man was there, standing in the doorway, his eyes gleaming with insane delight. He wasn't coming after me, not yet, but he was watching. Watching as I fled, like a hunter savoring the chase. I didn't stop running until I hit the road, the headlights of a passing car blinding me. But when I looked back, there was nothing. No barn. No man. Just the empty stretch of road behind me. I never told anyone what happened that night. I don't know if anyone would believe me. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the sound of the shredder. And I can still see my brother's face, twisted in agony, as the machine chewed him up piece by piece. The loft was supposed to be off-limits, a place where the barn's owner kept the tools and equipment too dangerous or dirty for regular use. But we didn't care. Our curiosity always got the better of us. My friend, Josh, and I had been sneaking around the property for days, hoping to uncover something the old man had been hiding. It had been years since anyone had seen him. The property had been abandoned long before we were born. So when we finally found the trapdoor leading up into the loft, we couldn't resist. The wooden steps creaked beneath our feet as we climbed, the smell of mold and dust thick in the air. A faint metallic tang hung in the stagnant atmosphere, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked over at Josh, who gave me a nervous grin, but his eyes were wide with anticipation. "Bet you $100 we find something freaky," Josh whispered. I chuckled, but the unease gnawing at the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. There was something wrong with this place, something that didn't sit right. But our bravado pushed us onward, and after what felt like an eternity, we reached the top. The loft was dark, barely any light filtering through the cracked windows. Dust motes floated in the faint beams of sunlight, and the smell of rust and decay grew stronger. We stood there for a moment, just staring into the murky darkness. The shadows seemed to shift, and it felt like the barn itself was watching us. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed the first thing: the animals. They were hanging from the rafters, suspended by thick, rotting chains. Their bodies were grotesque, swollen and distorted. Some were barely recognizable: deer, goats, rabbits, but their faces were the worst part. They weren't just animal faces anymore. No, someone had crudely sewn human faces onto them. The faces were twisted, their expressions frozen in pain and terror, their eyes glazed over, staring in horror from beneath the matted fur and skin. The mouths were stretched in silent screams, skin pulled too tight over the skulls. I took a step back, my stomach lurching. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Josh, always the braver of the two of us, pushed forward. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, reaching up to touch one of the hanging animals. His hand froze just inches from the grotesque face of a rabbit. The skin was unnaturally cold, like it had been preserved, but the smell of decay was overwhelming. Before I could say anything, the barn doors slammed shut behind us, the sudden sound echoing through the loft. The hairs on my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no breeze, no reason for the door to have slammed shut. A figure stepped out from the shadows, dragging something heavy behind them. The figure was tall, hunched over, wearing a long, tattered coat that was caked in dirt and something darker, something that looked like blood. They moved slowly, dragging the sack across the floor with a disturbing slowness. The sack leaked thick, dark blood, staining the wooden floorboards beneath it. I needed more parts, the figure rasped, their voice deep and hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. My stomach churned. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Josh was frozen too, his eyes wide with terror. The figure continued to drag the sack closer, its contents shifting inside, making a sickening squelching sound. Then it hit me, the smell. It wasn't just blood. It was rot, decay, something worse. It smelled like something had died a long time ago, and whatever was in that sack had been preserved, or something had been done to it. I turned to Josh, my voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." But before I could say anything more, the figure reached into the sack. It was then I saw what they were pulling out. Pieces of flesh, bone, and more faces. The faces were still attached to strips of skin and muscle, dripping with blood as the figure held them up, inspecting them like they were mere scraps to be added to some collection. The faces, they were still alive. I gagged, my vision swimming. The faces twitched, their eyes blinking, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. The figure turned and began to place the faces onto the hanging animals, sewing them in with an unnerving precision. Each animal that had been missing its human face now had a new one, each more grotesque than the last. Josh was shaking now, his face pale and covered in sweat. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. I reached for him, but before I could touch him, I heard a noise, the sound of something cracking. It was followed by a sickening snap. Josh screamed. I turned just in time to see his body slam into the ground as if something had yanked him off the ladder. His bones were bent in unnatural angles, his arms and legs twisted as though they had been crushed under a heavy weight. Blood poured from his mouth, staining the floor as his body jerked violently. The figure stood over him, their hands still clutching a needle and thread, which dripped with fresh blood. Without a word, they dropped the sack and bent down, starting to pull the pieces of Josh's body apart. A grotesque crack echoed through the room as they disjointed his limbs, tossing them aside like they were nothing more than spare parts. The air was thick with the sounds of flesh tearing, bones snapping. My legs finally gave out, and I crumpled to the floor, unable to tear my eyes away from the horror unfolding before me. The figure continued its work, now adding Josh's face to one of the new animal carcasses. I wanted to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. Every muscle in my body screamed, but I couldn't move. My vision blurred, and my hearing became muffled as I heard the figure's raspy breaths growing louder, the sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing. Everything went black. The barn my family inherited had always been a place of mystery, a relic from the past tucked away at the edge of our property. I'd heard stories from my grandparents about its history, vague whispers of the barn being the site of strange occurrences, but I never paid much attention. After all, old houses and barns often have their fair share of rumors. It wasn't until that one summer night that I realized how wrong I was, and how deep the darkness truly ran. That night, the air hung thick with humidity, and the oppressive stillness of the country night wrapped itself around me like a vice. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. Strange noises echoed in the distance, muffled groans, like the low murmur of something struggling for life, followed by a chilling silence. The barn stood just past the tree line, a dark, hulking structure barely visible under the light of the moon. It seemed like it was calling to me, beckoning me with a promise of answers I didn't yet understand. Despite the chill creeping over me, I grabbed my flashlight and crept out of my room. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. As I stepped outside, the cool breeze brushed against my face, and I instinctively pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The path to the barn was a familiar one, but tonight, it felt different. The moon hung low, casting long shadows over the grass as I made my way toward the barn. When I reached the barn, a strange smell hit me first, like rot and old blood, a pungent mix that clung to the air. I hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing the door open, the rusted hinges creaking loudly in the silence. Inside, the barn was cloaked in shadows, the only light coming from my shaky flashlight. The smell grew stronger as I stepped further in, and I nearly gagged at the putrid stench. My heartbeat quickened, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. The sound of faint groaning reached my ears again, but this time it was louder, more urgent. I followed the noise, my feet crunching on the thick layer of dust and dirt that covered the floor. As I rounded the corner, I froze. Hooks. Dozens of hooks hung from the rafters above, each one draped with what looked like torn pieces of cloth. But as my flashlight flicked across them, I realized with horror that the cloth was flesh. Human flesh. The hooks held the remains of victims, their bodies twisted in grotesque contortions, their faces frozen in terror. Some were barely recognizable, their skin flayed open to reveal muscle and bone. Blood had long since dried, leaving dark stains on the floor beneath them. I took a step back, bow rising in my throat, but the sight before me wasn't the worst of it. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something hanging from the farthest corner of the barn. A body. But it wasn't like the others. This one was fresh. The body was suspended by its wrists, its skin completely stripped away, leaving nothing but raw muscle and sinew. Blood dripped slowly from the exposed tissue, pooling beneath the corpse in a thick, crimson puddle. Its face. I could barely make out the features through the torn skin, but the twisted expression of agony was unmistakable. The eyes were wide open, glassy with fear, and the mouth was contorted into a silent scream. I staggered backward, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to make sense of the scene. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing for an explanation. But none came. That's when I heard the whisper. "You're next." It was barely audible, like a soft rasp, but the words sent a jolt of terror through my body. My flashlight flickered, and I swung it wildly, my pulse roaring in my ears. The beam of light caught something, a movement, just at the edge of my vision. Then I saw him. The butcher. He stood in the shadows, watching me with cold, dead eyes. His face was a grotesque mask, made from strips of human flesh crudely stitched together, the seams running jagged and uneven across his features. The flesh hung loosely, barely held together by the coarse stitching, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that seemed far too wide for a normal person. The sight of him made my stomach churn, and I instinctively took a step back, but the floor beneath me felt like it was made of glue, every movement slow and labored. The butcher's hands were covered in blood, thick, dark red streaks running up his arms and dripping from his fingertips. His hands weren't just bloody, they were covered in fresh, sticky flesh, like he had just gutted someone, tearing through their insides with a brutal, savage efficiency. His fingers twitched, flexing as if eager to tear into something else. "You're next," he repeated, his voice a sickening rasp, the sound more animalistic than human. He stepped forward, the rustle of his clothing disturbing the still air, and I could hear the sickening squelch of his boots as they sank into the blood-soaked floor. The butcher's face was a macabre sight, but it was the blood-stained knives he held that truly sent my mind spiraling. There were two, each long and wickedly sharp, their blades gleaming with the fresh remnants of his past victims. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The barn felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from every side as I stumbled blindly toward the exit. My breath was ragged, and I could hear the butcher's footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like he was savoring the chase. I reached the door and threw myself at it, slamming my shoulder into the weathered wood. It creaked but wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, my hand scrabbling at the doorknob, my mind screaming for release. The butcher was closer now, his breath hot on my neck, and I could hear the scrape of his knives against the floor as he closed in. Just as I felt the cold grip of his fingers brush against my shoulder, I finally managed to force the door open. I didn't even look back, I just ran, faster than I ever thought I could, my legs pumping with adrenaline as I tore through the field, away from the barn, away from the horror. I didn't stop running until I was back inside the house, locked in my room, heart racing, sweat coating my skin. But even now, I can still feel the butcher's eyes on me, his whisper in my ears. And I know one thing for sure, he'll be back.